אקסל Boersch-Supan, או הומלאוט, למי שאוהב גרמנית. הוא מנהל פרויקט אשר באירופה, שגם ישראל שותפה לו. זה פרויקט מאוד מאוד חשוב של איסוף נתונים השוואתיים של אנשים בני 50 ומעלה, ומנהל מכון מקס פלנק עדיין במינכן, ואנחנו הולכים לשמוע הרצאה שאני חושב שהיא מעניינת, וכדאי שתזכרו שזה אחד המומחים הגדולים באמת לפנסיה. הוא גם תרם תרומות תיאורטיות והוא גם בעולם המעשי. אז אקסל, בבקשה.
Hi, my name is Axel Boersch-Supan. I'm in Munich. Actually, I would really like to be in Jerusalem and meet you all. But as so often, since the 2 years of the pandemic, we'll sit in our office and do it virtually. Let me pull up my slides so we can begin the lecture. Okay, my title is Automatic Adjustment Mechanisms in Pension. And as you see, this will be a talk on contradiction between rationality on the one side and populism on the other side. So one of the contradictions in pension system design is that pension systems need to adapt to an often very hostile environment. I mean that demography comes with population aging, maybe with migration waves. Productivity growth in macroeconomics goes up and down, and recently we have quite a surge in inflation, which we have to tackle with. Now, this contradicts the demand of pensioners and workers who like stability and dependability. They want the same replacement rate as their parents. They want certainly no change in retirement age. So that's a big contradiction. There's another contradiction, which is that system stability requires long-term rules, such as wage indexation or price indexation, linking indexing retirement age to life expectancy. But attracting voters for the next election requires very often actionism, which ends up in the press. So increasing the minimum pension, giving pensioners, even if they're rich, an inflation bonus, and certainly rather reduce than increase the retirement age. These actions are very popular, and they're often chosen in spite of the rationality of system stability. We have to live with these two contradictions. And what I want to talk about is how actually structure the compromises and solutions of these contradictions. One of the main design ideas of rational system design are to split issues and not confuse issues. So the first thing is to really separate the issue of poverty prevention, because it underlies very, very different rules than the systems for the better to do. For those systems, I'm very much in favor of automatic adjustments, and we'll go through them. Now, in some sense, the ideal system is a fully funded system because it automatically adjusts, but it has its disadvantages. So let me go through these three different issues piece by piece. First, talk about poverty prevention. Now, this is done in many countries, including Israel, by installing means-tested base pensions. That has worked very often. I think there's still something to do in Israel. If you look at Israel, then poverty rates really are higher, quite a bit higher than in other countries. And particularly, they increased dramatically by age. The very old 76 plus in this graph here have much higher poverty rates than the people between 50 and 65. So the idea of a poverty prevention by a minimum wage is obvious and easy, but it has to be done in a systematic and reasonable way to prevent high poverty rates of more than 20%, like in Israel. For the rest of the population, say the upper 80%, so lower middle class, upper class, we really have to think about automatic adjustments. The most elegant way to do a rational system design, even in a pay-as-you-go pillar, are the so-called notional defined contribution systems, which have been installed primarily first in Sweden and later in Italy and other countries, for example, in the Baltic countries. Now, they work quite nicely. So even if it's a pay-as-you-go system, all contributions are credited on a lifetime basis to an individual account, but it's a notional account. And these accounts are in currency basis, so in euros or kroner in Sweden. And the accounting rules are equivalent to financial accounts. So the balance accumulates with some kind of interest, and this should be the pay-as-you-go interest rate, which tends to be the productivity rate plus the rate of growth, which depends on demographic growth in the country. Now, in old age, when you start retiring, this retirement account balance is converted into annuity, just using the usual rates for annuities, which allows quite some flexibility in the choice of retirement age, because the annuity will be larger if you retire later, and smaller if you retire early. All this can be done nicely according to actuarial rules, which react, and this is the very trick of adaptation in this notional defined contribution system. It reacts automatically to longevity due to the annuities. It reacts to the macroeconomy due to productivity changes, and it reacts to other demographic changes, for example, migration by the rate of growth of the population. So it's a very elegant system, and it has worked well in Sweden. I'm very much in favor of such systems, but they require a large system revolution in some sense, which has been done well in Sweden, not so well in Italy. It failed in Poland, and it was never implemented, for example, in my own country, in Germany, because too many people were afraid of such a system. So what to do? Probably it's better to go in a piecemeal approach, which is to link the retirement age by some kind of formula and link the replacement rate to the system dependency by some formula. And I'll show you how to do this, starting with the retirement age, actually quite straightforward. Divide the longevity gains, which are typical for aging populations, between work and retirement. Now, if you think about how many years you need to finance a year of retirement, you quickly come up with 2 years of work. Because almost everywhere in the world, the working life is about 40 years and retirement is about 20 years, which is exactly 2 to 1. So dividing the longevity gains between work and retirement to create an indexation mechanism of retirement age to longevity leads you to a 2.1 rule, where 3 added life years are divided into 2 added work years and 1 added year of retirement. A very simple rule, which is easy to communicate, which even politicians who are opposed to rules, I think will understand. And where you can actually cite evidence that it has been implemented, for example, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Norway, and even in France in the private sector. Now, it's a little bit more complicated to think about how to index the replacement rate. Now, again, if there are more pensioners and less workers, the dependency rate will go down, and one has to adapt the generosity of the pension system. Now, if you go through the math, then there are two ways which are very conventional to do so. So let me go actually through the math. Revenues of a pension system are the contribution rate times the wage times the number of workers. Expenditures are the replacement rate times the wage times the number of pensioners. If you solve that equation, you see that the relation of the contribution rate to the replacement rate is exactly the same as the number of pensioners divided by the number of workers. What is the dependency rate? In population aging, that dependency rate goes up. Now, if you keep the replacement rate constant, some people call that the defined benefit principle, then you need to increase the contribution rate, which really puts all the burden of the younger generation. So it keeps the pensioners stable at the expense of the younger generation. Now, the opposite policy does exactly the opposite, keeps the contribution rate constant, the so-called DC principle. Then you need to decrease the replacement rate, which puts all the burden on the older generation. Now, really the obvious compromise between the two is to index the changes in benefits, pension benefits, both to wages and to the dependency ratio. The wages are here, the dependency ratio is that. You choose, the politician actually chooses some weighted mean between the two, and you get any kind of compromise between defined principle, the DB principle, and the DC principle. Now, the art of the econometrician is to measure this, both parts, the changes in wages, the changes in the dependency ratio, and then talk to the politician to find out what a reasonable compromise in terms of alpha is. If alpha is equal to 1, then you're back to the DB principle. If alpha is 0, you're back to the DC principle. And anything in between can be negotiated. The second part here is called the sustainability factor. And it's a neat way to actually forge a compromise between these principles. Now, fully funded pillars actually are quite automatically adjusting to both demography and macroeconomic changes. And they do this in a very similar kind of way as the NTC systems that we talked earlier about, which have been realized in Sweden and in Italy. There are various methods to actually implement fully funded pillars. In Israel, it is mandatory, works via occupational pensions and the state. In other countries like the US and in my own country, Germany, they're voluntary. There are, again, compromises between those two principles, mandatory versus voluntary, individual accounts versus collective accounts, which are, for example, created in Great Britain using quite a bit of nudging. I don't want to go into details today in my rather short lecture, but want to point out that some countries really have decided to put a lot of effort in creating large pension funds. And Israel, in some sense, is a front runner on a global scale. And it has more asset and pension funds per GDP than, for example, the United States or Canada. There are other countries here who have remained very much in the pay-as-you-go system, and the big European countries are part of that. France, Italy, and Germany are what I point out here. And you see that their assets and pensions are minute relative to GDP as compared to Canada, the United States, Great Britain, Israel, or Australia. However, what I want to point out is that funded pillars have their own and still very serious problems. They do not address issues of the poor. They cannot really prevent poverty prevention, as has been shown in many countries. Israel is one of those, but Chile also belongs to that. The Chilean funded pillar has been good for the upper middle class, but it failed to address the poor. But even for the middle class people, there are serious problems. Markets have failed to weed out costly pension plans, and part of the high costs of these pension plans have been due to bad asset allocation. A lot of investment has been in government bonds. There's a very strong home bias. You see this all over Europe, less so in the United States, but also very strongly in Israel. In Europe, at least, there's evidence that there's a large lack of information. Neither do the employees really know much about asset allocation, nor the employers in occupational pension plans. So my conclusion is you still need adaptable pay-as-you-go systems for the less affluent. And what I mean with the less affluent is really more than half of the population. Let me conclude. How to design adaptive pension systems. The main challenge is really to take care of the poor, at the same time take care of the sustainability issues in the wake of population aging. The guiding principles should be the separate issues, separate poverty, the issues how to create automatic stabilizer. It is really, in some sense, two separate, maybe three separate pension systems one should talk about. The basic pension for the poor, the automatic stabilizers for the more affluent, but not really rich, and funded pillars for those who are better off. The base pension pillar should be means tested, and then they have proven to be good against old age poverty. First pillar reforms of the pay-as-you-go system needed automatic adjustment, both of the retirement age, life expectancy, as I say, best by 2 to 1, and successful compromises between the DC and the DB system, for example, with the sustainability factor. Notionally defined contributions are even better, I think, but they're hard to implement. Now, the political reality, and here we come to our second contradiction, I said, looks very different. We see in many countries that populist temptations weigh more than these rational pension design temptations. So our task is to invent compromises which are bearable for politicians, but still work in economics. And examples are the sustainability factor and the 2 to 1 retirement rule, which I think are a key to compromises between populist temptations and rational pension policy. Let me end with that, and thank you very much for your attention. It was fun talking to you, and I wish you a very nice conference proceeding in Jerusalem. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
כיוון שאני באופן בסיסי מורה, אני לא יכול להתאפק אלא להגיד משהו על ההרצאה ששמעתם. העולם של הפנסיה לפעמים מביאים לנו את כל הביטויים האלה, DC, DB וכל הדברים האלה, ואנחנו יוצאים מבולבלים. אני חושב שהמסר המרכזי שצריך לעבור מההרצאה הזאת, והוא מתחת לטכניקה של שיטות שונות של מימון וכן הלאה, שהבעיה הגדולה של הפנסיה היא הבעיה של הפוליטיקל איקונומי. זאת הבעיה הגדולה. הדבר המפתיע, הייתי אומר, במדינת ישראל, הדבר המפתיע במדינת ישראל היא איך הייתי אומר, האנרגיה הרפורמטורית של אנשים בפקידות הציבורית, כמו הממונה שאתם שמעתם קודם, איך היכולת בסופו של דבר היא לעשות רפורמות. זה דבר שמאוד מאוד מפתיע. למשל, הרפורמה של האגרות חוב המיועדות, אני לא בטוח שהייתה עוברת בצרפת או באיטליה או במקומות כאלה. בישראל היא עברה. זאת חידה. למה זה עבר כל כך טוב? זאת רפורמה טובה, באמת רפורמה טובה, אבל אפשר בקלות להתנגד. הממשלה בורחת, הממשלה מסירה אחריות, אי אפשר להאמין להם וכן הלאה וכן הלאה.